change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And there's already been one meeting of the evil empire where the kings of all the Southland areas have all decided to join forces. And we read about that last week back in chapter 9. And it was only the city of Gibeon, which was the only kingdom who had opted out of this alliance. And so now this king, Adonizedek, he hears that Israel has peace with Gibeon and that they have a defense pact. Where now Gibeon, who was this former ally of all the other kings, has now made peace with the invaders, Israel. And what's really bothering King Adonizedek is why Gibeon would join forces with Israel. Because Gibeon was not a small city like Ai. Gibeon was a force to be contended with. It was a city that could hold its own in a battle. It was a great state. It was a wealthy kingdom. It was a royal kingdom. It was a warrior city filled with trained men of war who all carried some weight in the community. And it was probably something else that was bothering this king. And it's where he is seeing that Israel isn't like them. That they're conquering these places like Jericho, and they're taking nothing from it. But they only did it for the glory of God. And then the same thing with Ai, where they destroyed it, but they didn't use it to make a profit. And that's because that's not the way that they did business. Because of all these small kingdoms, they were all about war. That's what they did. That's how their kingdoms were structured. That's how they made a living. It was all about building these armies, building them bigger and stronger and better armies. And when they came to your city, they would take all your food. They would take anything they wanted. They would rape your women, they'd take all your animals, and they would make your people their slaves. But Israel didn't do that. Their God was their cause. So for them, it wasn't about acquiring stuff. It was about pleasing Him. And this God was giving them a place. And the place He's giving them is a place that these kingdoms have been living for years. And now Israel is in alliance with one of the most powerful kingdoms in Canaan, a royal city. And so now King Adonizedek, he calls the dark forces together again for a second meeting of the evil alliance, and they change their strategy. And now they decide to attack the kingdom that dared to stand up against the crowd, to go against the Gibeonites. So if they won't join us, they're no longer our friends. We will destroy you, and we'll destroy your new friends, which is the same way it is for a lot of us as believers. Where our old friends, they don't want to hang out with us anymore. Now that you found God, and you find it's because they hate the things of God. And so now they don't like you anymore. And you kind of wonder if it ever crossed any of the minds of any of these other kingdoms, if Israel's God was willing to make peace with any of them. But I don't think it ever crossed any of their minds. And I think it's because they hate God and that they loved the way they lived their life. And so this was not going to be a fair fight. This was going to be 5 kings against 1. And these are the 5 largest, most powerful kingdoms in all of southern Canaan. And it will be against the one who dared to defect, the one who changed their beliefs. And southern Canaan, it was not a unified nation. Adonizedek, he brought them all together. But these are all important cities because of their locations and because of their association with the trade routes. but they're not brave enough to attack Israel directly, but they're not afraid to attack Gibeon at all. And God here, he is using all of these events for his own purposes, so that all of these city-states could be conquered at one time. So this is instead of Israel having to go fight each one of them one by one inside of their walled cities. And so now these 5 kings, their armies, they show up at Gibeon's doorstep, and they camp right outside of Gibeon. But Gibeon, they were able to get some messengers out to Joshua, and they say, "Don't forsake your servants, save us. Because all the Amorite kings are surrounding us, because we're allied with you." So Gibeon here is proclaiming protection under the basis of their covenant relationship with Israel, because now they belong to them. They are their servants. And I don't know, but if you were Joshua here and you knew that you had made this bad covenant with these people, where the covenant you made actually caused you to break God's commandment, you might be tempted to think, well, good, problem solved. They will take care of this bad covenant that we made, and we won't be guilty about it at all because we didn't break our covenant. We didn't destroy them. And you might even want to think that God was doing this for you until God speaks to you and he tells you not to fear them. I have delivered all of them into your hand. And so here Joshua, he doesn't turn his back on Gibeon, even if this would get him out of making his bad vow. Because what you have to see here is that God is even using Joshua's mistake of making this covenant with Gibeon to accelerate his conquest of Canaan. And it's just like how God had used Joshua's mistake at Ai to be able to conquer Ai and Bethel. Because God will even use our mistakes and sometimes even our own disobedience toward his victories that he has for us in our lives if we're committed to doing his will. And every time God has promised Joshua victory, Joshua's had a victory. And then by God saying, I have delivered them into your hand, not a man of them shall stand before you. What God is saying here, in the way he's saying this is a prophetic past tense, which means that this is a done deal. But even though it's given, and even though it's a done deal, it doesn't mean that you don't have to work for it. And it doesn't even mean you don't have to work hard for it. You might have to work until you're all worn out. And as Christians, just like Israel, we will be battling our enemies for the rest of our lives. And so God must have spoken to Joshua immediately after the messengers arrive, because what they do is they leave right away and they take off that night and they march all night long. And that march was 20 miles long and it was all uphill. It was 3,300 feet uphill. And so this would have taken them between 8 to 10 hours to make that climb. And so that means it took them the whole night. And that all of those men, they had to be weary when they arrived. But even being weary, the Lord set up all the circumstances. And God routed the enemy right in front of them, where it says, Israel came upon them suddenly. And so at the city of Gibeon, Israel killed the enemy with a great slaughter. But it's not over yet, because they start chasing the enemy downhill on this road that goes down to Beth Horon. And that's about a 800 feet drop to Azekah. And so this is a very steep slope, and it levels off every so often, and it has all these terraces. And so Israel, they continue down, and they're killing a lot of men on the descent. And then God starts assisting them, and he starts casting down these large hailstones on the enemy. And it says that God killed more with his hailstones than Israel did with their swords. And some people will try to make this sound like this was some kind of natural phenomenon, but it can't be, because it was only the enemy soldiers that were hit. There was not one Jew killed here. And you have to see that God, he has unlimited resources, and that he's willing to use them for us to succeed in our lives, for his plans for our lives. But in the same way, God, he also has unlimited resources to use against us if we decide to rebel against him. And that would be like with the story of Jonah. And here now Joshua, he's seeing this miracle of these hailstones, and it gives Joshua this boldness to ask for another miracle. Because even after this miraculous hailstones, the victory isn't still complete. Joshua, he still doesn't have enough daylight left to finish the task he was commanded by God. And so Joshua, he shouts out publicly in front of everybody, and he says, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon." And then he shouts, "Moon in the valley of Ajalon," because Joshua wants to keep this battle going. He wants it completed once and for all. And I like how God records Joshua praying this prayer out loud publicly, where everyone could hear it. And I like that because that lets all of us know that God, that he's willing to move heaven and earth for us if what we're doing is according to his will. And it's not any different than what Jesus said. If you have the faith of a mustard seed, you'll say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. And God, he has no problem answering with the supernatural for us to be successful in what he's called us to do. And so what we need to see here, that God never promises never to have any battles in life. And once you become a Christian, like we said, you'll be battling for the rest of your life. But in our battles, God will give you what you need to be successful. And it's going to be great, and you're going to be very glad you did it. And then here with this miracle that Joshua asked, this is actually considered to be the biggest miracle in the whole Bible, because this miracle, this one affects the whole solar system. And there's a lot of theories of how God did this, and no one knows for sure how he did it. But for God, this was easy. And the problem that scientists and some theologians have is, how could God stop the rotation of the earth without creating chaos all over the whole world? Because our world, it spins like a top at a rotation of about 1,000 miles per hour. But God, he is never imprisoned in any way by his creation. He has no problem suspending the laws that he's created. And the way I look at this as like, I can stop my watch at any time I want at my own will. And I can move the time forward and I can move the time backwards whenever I want to. And I didn't even make my own watch, but God, he made the universe. But with my watch, I just usually let it keep time. I just let it run just like usual. But I always have control over it. And then there's this phrase that's being used there in verse 13 where it says, "and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day." And the way that that's written, it indicates that there was a retardation of the movement, that it was not a total stopping of the sun and the moon, but that it is just moving slowly. And the way I look at this, it's kind of like the Matrix, where like you can dodge all the, and I know it's nothing like that, but that's how I think. It's like, but people, they're always trying to figure out some type of natural solution. And even if there was a natural solution, it would have still been God. And some Christians, like Chuck Smith and David Guzik, they point to Immanuel Velikovsky's book, Worlds in Collision, and it'll talk about these things like comets and asteroids, or Venus trying to enter into our solar system, passing close to the Earth. And I don't know if any of that's true, but he also documents in that book this extra long day. And there's others who also document about this extra long day in history, where it was written of in the Egyptian history and in Babylonian history and in the Greek history and Chinese histories. And there was an extra long night in the Inca history, and a day where the sun never rose past the horizon. And I don't know how it happened. I just know that it happened and I believe it. And there's something you have to realize here is that the Christian faith is a miraculous faith, where not everything has a natural explanation. That doesn't work with Christianity. And then to quote one of Salem's favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, he says, the mind that asks for a non-miraculous Christianity is a mind in the process of relapsing from Christianity into mere religion. And if you've ever heard about those stories about how the NASA scientists, they had to calculate that long day of Joshua to be able to, this formula for something they were trying to do, that story has been proven not to be true. That was just a made-up story. And then we're told about that this account was written about in the book of Jasher. And the book of Jasher is not part of the Bible. And we don't have that book anymore, though there is a book called the book of Jasher, but it's not this book of Jasher. It's not the original. But the book of Jasher is also mentioned in 2 Kings 1:18, and it contains the eulogy of King David for King Saul. And so then after all this, it says that they returned back to the camp at Gilgal. But that phrase there is believed to be a quotation from that book of Jasher, because Israel did not return to Gilgal till after the defeat of central Canaan. They had made a temporary camp, and we'll read it later on down in a few scriptures, at Makkedah near Libnah. Okay, so now you have Joshua here, and he gets this message that all 5 kings have been found hiding in this cave at Makkedah. But Joshua, he doesn't get distracted by the 5 kings imprisoned in the caves, because that's not the big issue here. The 5 kings being captured, that's just a secondary issue. Because Joshua isn't here to conquer kings. What he's doing is he's taking possession of the land, and continuing the fight is the big thing. So what you see here is that Joshua, he doesn't have any ego in this. It's not about conquering kings. And these imprisoned kings, they can be dealt with later. But now what he has to do is he has to finish the battle. And he has to stop the enemy soldiers from re-entering into their cities. And Joshua's instructions to his men was to roll this big stones over the cave and to have just some of the men guard the cave, but the rest of you get back in the fight and attack the rear guard. And so they did. And they didn't allow the enemy to enter their fortified city. But a few of them, they did. They got back to their own cities. But then after this long day, they went back and made camp at Makkedah, like I told you before. And it says in peace. And they have peace because they didn't lose any men. And so you have these men who had to be tired because they had been on the move since the night before, and then they spent the whole day fighting, and then it's been extended with an extra long day, and now they get to rest in peace. And then the next day, Joshua tells them to open the cave to bring out the 5 kings. And that was the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And Joshua has them bring these kings to him, and he calls all the men of Israel there, and he shows them that these kings, that they are just men. And then he tells all the captains to come over to them. He tells them to put their feet on their necks, which means that these kings are in total subjection to them. And then Joshua, he tells the captains the same things that the Lord had been saying to him since he became the leader of Israel. He tells them not to be afraid. And he tells them, don't be dismayed. And he tells them, be strong and of good courage, because he's making these men into becoming leaders like himself. Joshua wasn't going to be around forever, and these battles were going to go on for a long time. And so it's kind of like Joshua, he's making disciples and he's raising up leaders. And he wants to build their confidence in the Lord, that the Lord will do these kind of things for them, that God will be the one who fights their enemies, and that God will give them victories over kings, because there's going to be a lot more kings coming. And then Joshua, he kills these kings himself, and he hangs them on trees till evening. And this might seem kind of gruesome and very humiliating, and it might even seem to be a bit cruel. But the other kingdoms of this day, they would have tortured the kings, and they would have made sport of them. And they may have even hung them alive, and they would have left their bodies to rot there on those trees. But Israel here, they didn't torture the kings. The kings were dead when they hung them on the trees, and they did exactly what the law said to do to those that were hung on a tree. And so all these kings were taken down by sunset. And then they made that cave that they hid in, they made that to be another memorial, and they made it a burial place. And so they threw the kings in there, and they placed these large rocks over the mouth of the cave. And it said that remained like that to this day, which means it remained like that to the day that this book was written. And then we're told that it was the same day that they went back to Makkedah. You kind of want to say Mackinac, but it's not, it's Makkedah. And they took that city and they killed their king. And then they went to Libnah and they took that city and they killed their king. And from there, they take the cities of the kings that they had already killed, that they had buried in the cave, and they take Lachish and Eglon. And then we see that Gezer, they tried to help, but they were just a bunch of old geezers, and so they couldn't help much, and so they killed them. And Lachish, they got themselves killed. And it's believed that these other 6 cities, that it took a period of weeks to maybe up to a couple months to be defeated. But the city of Jerusalem, it was never taken because they had a very strategic location in Jerusalem. It won't be taken until the reign of King David, about 500 years later than this. And then Joshua, he conquers each city one at a time. And it mentions Debar and Kadesh Barnea, and it mentions Goshen, but this is not the same Goshen that was in Egypt. This is a Goshen that's in Canaan. And then after they finished conquering all the southern kingdoms on this campaign, they returned back to their first camp where they all started, back in Gilgal. And then we start chapter 11. And this is a totally different campaign. And this is the conquering of the northern kingdoms. And this chapter is a lot shorter. And so you might want to think, well, this is not such a big deal. It's just kind of like a continuation of that last campaign. But this was a really big deal. Though it starts kind of like the last one in chapter 10, but instead of King Adoni-Zedek, it's this king named Jabin, who's of the city of Hazor. And he's been hearing about all of these battles, where now Israel is conquering everyone that they come across. And Hazor here is the biggest city in all of the northern kingdoms. And if you remember, the size of Jericho, it was only about 8 acres large inside of their city walls. But Hazor is 200 acres inside of their city walls. And now this King Jabin, he's gathering all the kings from all the northern kingdoms. And so this is a lot more than just the 5 kings from the Southland. And Chinneroth here, that's the area of the Galilee. In fact, the Sea of Galilee used to be called the Sea of Chinneroth. But a lot of these cities, we don't know where they are because we don't know them from their old names. And so their locations are not all found. But the people that have been gathered here, they go all the way up to Mount Hermon, just south of Lebanon.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,